Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Michelle Loy. I'm the Executive Director of the Financial Management Association International, and we are very pleased to partner with the Finance, Economics, and Banking Research Network, we call them FEB-RN, to host a series of virtual seminars featuring researchers at the forefront of their fields. And today's researcher whom is delivering today's seminar is one of the best examples of that. A good friend of FMA, an amazing scholar in his field, John Karpoff from the University of Washington. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my friend Cesario for him to give a few remarks before we get started.
Thank you, Michelle. And as a global network, FEBRN with FMA, today is a good example because we have our speaker on the seminar today from the US, and Michelle is in the US as well. I'm in Europe, and Shumi, which is going to moderate the seminar today, is in the University of Sydney in Australia. So that's really global, cannot be more than today. So many thanks for attending the seminar today. I'm passing now to Shumi Akhtar, that she's moderating the seminar today, and you take it from here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cesario. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I'm Shumi Akhtar, Associate Professor in the Finance discipline in the University of Sydney Business School. So I'll be serving as a moderator for this seminar. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome Professor John Karpoff to our seminar series today. Before I hand over to the floor, let me briefly introduce Professor Karpoff. He is the Washington Mutual Endowed Chair in Innovation and a professor in finance and business economics at the Foster School of Business, University of Washington. Professor Karpoff is a leading scholar in the field of business valuation, corporate finance, and corporate governance. His current research looks into corporate governance, corporate misconduct, and enforcement, as well as some broader issues within corporate finance. He currently serves as a council chair of the Society for Financial Studies and is an associate editor for both the Journal of Finance and GFQA. He has also served as associate editor for premier journals, including Journal of Financial Economics and Management Science. So Professor Karpoff is widely recognized for his excellence in both teaching and research, with many awards and accolades, a rare and admirable achievement in our profession. He likes doing fun things like hiking, climbing, and skiing. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Karpoff for his presentation titled A Theory of Social Capital and Trust. And to our audience, please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and I'll try my best to attend to those after the presentation is over in 45 minutes. Thank you. And over to you, Professor Karpoff.
Wow. Thank you, Shumi. That was very kind. And I'd really like to express my thanks to Michelle, Cesario, the FMA, the FEB. This has been a premier seminar series for so long, and I've very much appreciated previous seminars, and I was online watching just the last several days, learning if there are any tricks of the trade from previous presenters. And it's a delight to be able to participate as a presenter. Let me share my screen. Hopefully this is working. I'd like to talk about social capital and trust. This is a project with my colleague Quentin DuPont. And I first want to acknowledge that these terms are fairly high-minded sounding. They're widely used, but they're sort of ambiguous, fuzzy terms in our concepts and in our field, I should say. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about first the idea of social capital and the idea of trust, and then get into a little bit of the details of our model and our approach, and then as time allows at the back, to step back a little bit and talk about why these issues I think are important and compelling for us. So there's something called the International Social Capital Association. And one thing that they have done is simply count papers from the Web of Science over time that have a focus on social capital. And as you can see, the count has grown over time, especially the last 20 years or so. And you might think that this is primarily in fields outside of finance, but that's not really the case, or I should say it's also the case in finance. The top areas of these publication counts include an area such as sociology or management that we might anticipate, but also at the top are economics and business. So our fields and adjacent fields are among the leading users of this term, social capital. So in the financial economics field, this has also, again, been a very popular term. This is just a cutout from part of a larger spreadsheet where Quentin and I have tried to understand and track some of the work done by others who have sort of been pioneers in this area in our field. And as you can see, there are a number of economic outcomes that people associate with the idea of social capital. Social capital, for example, is associated with things like creditor rights, more equal incomes, stock returns during crisis, VC financing, a broad range of outcomes. However, this does raise the question of just what is social capital? Again, it's a term that suggests some potential benefits of community action or shared social norms, but it's a term that has a very little precise agreement on. So, for example, if I add one more column to the previous snippet from the spreadsheet, where I've added the main concept for social capital used by the authors of these papers, you can see this lack of agreement or consensus on exactly what this term means exists in our field as well. So social capital is sometimes viewed as trust, civic norms, institutions, generalized trust, bonding trust, bridging trust. There are notions of personalized and generalized trust. There's a lot of different, again, hard to pin down, but seemingly important notions being associated with this term. Now, to think about what social capital is, it might be worthwhile acknowledging and trying to jump into the very deep pool outside of our field that has tried to wrestle with this issue. Now, the term social capital is, there are many potential claimants to the original use of the term. I mean, even Jane Austen refers to the term when one of her characters in Sense and Sensibility refers to a social gathering as having social capital, suggesting that it was an event in which there was a fair amount of prestige and status seeking and status gained. A more modern attribution of the term dates back to a 1955 book by Edward Banfield. Banfield spent about a year in a small town in southern Italy and was puzzled by the sort of the interrelationships between local social customs and economic activity, and was trying to puzzle out why this particular community seemed to be trapped in economic poverty. And he conceived of social capital as an ability to transcend the immediate material interest of the family to act together for the common good. Coming up to date a little bit, a very popular conception of social capital is associated with Robert Putnam. Putnam is the guy who wrote this book called Bowling Alone, and perhaps many people here are familiar with this. The title of this book both characterizes Putnam's conception of social capital and his concern with the demise of social capital as he saw it in American society. And he thought of social capital as reflecting and embodying the social networks and norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness that yield value for people and allow people to act together. And he was concerned that through the demise of civic organizations such as the Kiwanis Club or even bowling clubs, that people were increasingly being left to operate in their own silos of ethnic or community, ethnic or family or religious subcommunities, and not cutting across the community and interacting in ways that today we might refer to as polarization. Well, those are just two conceptions of social capital. I mentioned the Institute for Social Capital Research, and they have done us the good deed of tracking different types of concepts of social capital that appear to be most cited in the broader literature. And the top 4 forms or definitions of social capital that show up in their citation counts are those that I've listed here on this slide, including Robert Putnam, but other concepts of social capital associated with the attributed authors here. I'm not going to go through and detail or try to summarize these concepts, but do want to use this as background to illustrate that there's a lot to sort out in thinking about what this term means, and then for us, how to think about how it relates to the things we care about, economic and financial outcomes. So, for example, is social capital primarily about people's values, attitudes, beliefs, or is it more about the outcome of these mental constructs? Is it a belief, such as trust or trustworthiness, or is it the act of trustworthiness? Is it simply positive reciprocity, as in our tit for tat games? Is it access to networks or access to human capital? Does it work at the individual level or the community level? As an example here, I have, you might think of you and your neighbors sharing social capital if you feel comfortable, walking across the street to borrow a cup of sugar. On the other hand, social capital might work at the community level, for example, as when you hold open the door for a stranger who you never expect to see again or interact with again. Is social capital owned by individuals or the community? Can we think of it as a public good? Can there be negative social capital? So I should say that we could have a similar series of slides and questions about our use of the word trust. Here's a brief list of different conceptions of trust in our literature. So this is the pool into which Quentin and I are attempting to jump, and we construct a framework that has several aspects, the highlights of which are identified in this slide. And I want to emphasize before talking about our particular framework that this is again, a big, nebulous, deep pool. There's even a literature I've learned as I've tried to read about this, primarily in sociology, of papers criticizing how other people use or misuse the concept of social capital. So I think it's possible to jump into this area without risking being just one more target of such criticism. And I think there's no way to come up with a particular definition or concept or framework without leaving out some aspects of social capital that are in the literature. So this isn't an attempt to be a comprehensive characterization of the concept. In our framework, we take advantage of the term social capital or the term capital in the term social capital to view social capital as an asset. It's an asset whose value arises from the social and psychological benefits of people working together. It's an asset with value that depreciates if people cheat. I'll use the term cheat broadly to refer to acts of outright fraud or opportunistic behavior or simple negligence. For cheaters or non-cooperators, the loss in value is typically, not always, but frequently accompanied by social stigma and disapprobation. That is, people may not want to associate with you, or you lose standing in your social club, and or the shame, guilt, and anxiety that are associated in the psychological literature with cognitive dissonance, as people act in ways that are not in accord with their self-image or their mental constructs of their ethical structure. Social capital in our framework includes both a common component that we will refer to as driven by culture and an idiosyncratic or personal component. This is a key difference between our conception and typical uses in our literature. I point out the idiosyncratic component is important if for no other reason than we observe different people within the same social grouping as having different levels of trustworthiness. Culture in this framework is therefore an input to social capital, and we think of trust as the main output. Trust, in turn, is what facilitates cooperative behavior and increases in material wealth. Let me tell you what I mean through an example. I thought I'd start with a simple transaction in which I'm considering entering with another person whom I shall refer to as Cesario. And Cesario, thank you for your, I guess, unknowing until now willingness to participate in my mental experiment here. So this transaction that we're thinking of getting into could be something very complex. It could be a joint venture between two firms. It could be something where I'm considering hiring Cesario to add an addition to my house. Or it could be something like a joint venture, like a joint research project. It could be something very simple too, like a purchase of a haircut or the purchase of a cup of coffee. In each of these situations, there is a point in this transaction where I place myself in a position of vulnerability. And the position of vulnerability is, could be something extreme, that my contractor runs off with my money. It could be something fairly trivial, such as I buy an apple and the apple turns out to be mushy. So nonetheless, I'm willing to engage, even though there's the risk that Cesario either has information about what he is offering me that I don't have and that will work to my detriment, or that Cesario may act in ways that work out to my detriment, and I don't get what I believe we have agreed to in the contract. Why am I willing to engage? Well, I believe, at least implicitly, that Cesario is going to perform on his end of the deal. And trust in our model is the probability that our counterparty is going to perform as promised and expected. Most of the time, this trust is justified. Cesario isn't going to cheat me. So if that happens, we each gain surpluses, which in our model we call little g B for me as the buyer and little g A for Cesario as the provider. And I want to emphasize throughout this whole exercise that I will refer to the buyer as trusting the seller and the seller as entering the transaction with social capital that helps to bond the guarantee of performance. But we could turn it around. It could be that the seller is also at risk from the buyer, or it could be that we're partners in a joint venture. The key is simply that looking at it from a particular point of view, my view as I enter this transaction, there is the possibility of cheating behavior and harm. Sometimes, however, my trust is not going to be borne out. And even though I trust Cesario, he doesn't perform as promised. And let's take the simple example of a cup of coffee. I go to Cesario to buy a cup of coffee, and Cesario might do something that is somewhat trivial. He simply doesn't pay attention. Maybe his cell phone is ringing as he's pulling my shot, and I don't get a nice ristretto pull of the shot, and I get a bad cup of coffee. Or it could be something more significant. He serves me the coffee in a cup that wasn't, in a sterile environment, and I get, salmonella poisoning along the way. In whether this is due to negligence, outright fraud, opportunistic behavior, Cesario has opportunities to gain something through negligence or fraud that we call B. And instead of getting a surplus from the transaction, I experience a loss C. Are there any consequences for Cesario if this happens? Well, the answer is yes. And otherwise, we have problems such as an Akhtar-Lemons problem where all trade breaks down. There are some potential consequences anyway for Cesario. The health department could come in, or I could sue him. Those are legal consequences. I could simply stop buying from him if I get a poor cup of coffee. But what I want to focus on are these last two items, the possibility of social disapprobation or cognitive dissonance associated with Cesario's sense or knowledge of not living up to his moral code. Those costs are associated with what we call a loss in social capital, or delta S. As a result, Cesario's net gain from cheating is the gain from the transaction plus the extra gain B from the cheating behavior minus this loss in social capital. At the end of this talk, I'd like to bring back the possibility of legal consequences and market forces through lost business or recontracting costs. But right now, I want to shut those avenues down and focus only on the social capital channel. Well, those previous green bean slides lay out a framework that can be summarized in this timeline. So in this timeline, we have two different dates, and in date one, the buyer, me in the previous example, is determining the minimum level of trust that's required for the expected value of the transaction to be at least non-negative. I'm also figuring out the probability that the seller is trustworthy. And for this to work, there has to be some uncertainty, something about which I don't know. And in our framework, what I don't know is the size of the seller's potential gain from cheating, B, in our framework. The buyer also then uses this information and engages in the transaction with probability. We can, in our model, we use a logistic transform to define the probability of the buyer entering the transaction. We could collapse it to simply the buyer enters the transaction only in situations where the risk neutral expected outcome is non-negative. And that happens by just collapsing this logistic transform in the second box here by having K be very large. But basically, in what's going on in date one is the buyer and seller each face their own problem, and the buyer figures out whether or not to enter the transaction. And then in date two, what happens is either there isn't a transaction or there is, and the seller either cheats or does not cheat, and the buyer and seller realize their gains and losses. I don't want to drag you through the details of this of the model, but rather use this framework to motivate the kinds of things that come out of the model. So I will occasionally refer to some of the algebra that summarizes these ideas, but I'm not going to get into the details of them. The first thing that I do want to point out is simply that you can take those gains and losses from the process and express them as gains from trade. So there's a gain from trade G here at the top, which is conditional on a trade occurring. And basically, it's just the weighted likelihood of, or weighted gains, I should say, if there's no cheating or if there is cheating. And then you can take that and express the unconditional expected gain that is unconditional on knowing whether the buyer is going to be willing to enter the transaction. So again, this is simply an expression of the gain or expected gain from cheating. And from this, we're able to derive some propositions that get us closer to providing some framework for understanding the relation between social capital and the kinds of outcomes that we tend to care about. So the first proposition is that despite the risk of costly cheating behavior, the conditional and unconditional expected gains from trade are both positive. And again, I won't drag you through all the math, but basically one way of seeing this is that you can first look at the conditional gain on expectation and rearrange the equation I had on the previous slide and break it down into components that each of which is positive. There is an exception. There is the possibility that buyers make extreme mistakes. They get into deals that have large negative expected outcomes. And we think of an example of this type of behavior would be the behavior of an addict entering certain types of transactions as just one example. But with that exception on the side, the unconditional expected gains from trade are positive in this framework. That then allows us to do some comparative statics simply by taking partial derivatives, generating additional propositions about how the probability of trade and the gains from trade change with trust and social capital. Let me give you an example. I'll just pick proposition 2 as an example, which is that the probability of trade increases with the buyer's trust in the seller. Now, this might seem sort of obvious, but it's nice that this does fall out of this framework. And one way one might think about using this framework is simply to provide some organizational structure for a number of really innovative papers that are already out there. And I've listed just 4 of the papers here, which show in various settings examples in which people's trust in their counterparties increases their willingness to engage in transactions with those counterparties. Or as another example, let me jump to Proposition 5. And I have to admit that what we call Proposition 5 is really, I think, one of our primary motives in trying to think about this. We have this intuition, and the intuition sort of just, is sort of surging through the empirical work in this area, that there is some connection between social capital and beneficial economic outcomes. And we wanted to examine whether or not we could see whether that holds together analytically. And here's the condition in our framework in which it does hold, that under certain conditions, the expected gain from trade does increase with the seller's social capital. And basically the condition as expressed here is just the condition that that there are not too many extreme possibility or extreme values, I should say, of the seller's gains from cheating. If W in our framework, which is the upper bound of the value that the gain from cheating can attain, if W is very high, then sometimes what happens is that the buyer gets into deals which ex post they should not have gotten into, and they end up getting cheated. And not only does the buyer end up losing, but the seller is willing to destroy their social capital in the process. And the combined losses of social capital and the loss to the buyer end up being negative, even on expectation in these extreme cases. As an example, I think of the Bernie Madoff scandal as possibly being an example of that. Here's a character who had tremendous social capital that he was willing to risk and squander because the gains from cheating were so extremely high. Well, again, here are several papers that are examples of this type of outcome in which social capital is positively associated with various types of outcomes that we tend to focus on. Financial development, for example, bank lending, economic growth. This framework can also be used to examine new questions. And here are 5 questions that, as time permits, I would like to provide some summaries about. One is simply what builds social capital. So let me move through these in turn. Well, we think of social capital, again, as having both a common component and an idiosyncratic or personal component. And so in our framework, the common component we refer to as arising from culture. And you can see there's a number of proxies for this common component that have been used in our literature: religion, geography, community norms, networks. And then there's also this personal component, which we think of as being investable. And examples which are not necessarily always investable personal characteristics in our literature include things such as CEO's military background or CEO's country of family origin. And this raises 2 different pathways by which social capital is built or destroyed. The first pathway is through external effects on the common component. Again, I don't want to go through the details of this equation other than to use it to point out some intuition, which is that we can express the total expected gain from a trade if it happens as now including some external effects of the seller's behavior on the broader community. And these external effects here are positive if the seller engages honestly in the transaction, or negative if cheating occurs. And one way we can think about this is that honest dealing builds upon the common component of social capital that is therefore available for all other members of that community grouping, building their social capital, helping to bond their relationships and their economic activities with other people. And likewise, there are negative potential external benefits, as illustrated in the two papers I've listed here as examples, in which there are these spillover effects in which fraud by one party spills over and affects people's trusting behavior in other activities and causes them to withdraw, in this case, from financial investing. Another way in which we might think about social capital being built is through the personal investment activities of each individual, in this case, each individual seller. So one thing we wanted to explore is whether or not the expected gain, the unconditional expected gain, now just not to the overall community, but just to the seller, how that changes with that seller's social capital. And I want to point out merely that it turns out that this relation has both a negative and a positive component. So the sign of the benefits of social capital to the seller, are going to depend on parameter values. In most cases, it turns out, with the parameter values that we've been considering and range of combinations of such values, it turns out that the marginal benefit of extra social capital to the seller is positive, but not monotonic. If we include simple production and cost functions, you might think about the cost I should say, the production of social capital at the individual level, involving things such as engaging in, say, certain spiritual or religious practices in ways that convey to your counterparties that you have an ethical core. Or it could be something as simple as engaging in costly fulfillment of your previous agreements and having that track record being something that helps build your personal component of the social capital that you bring to each of your transactions. And most of the parameterizations that we are doing, we're getting a picture that looks like this right-hand side graph, where the cost of investing in social capital increase at the margin, the benefits increase, but then eventually decrease at the margin, and you get an interior optimum investment by the individual. It's also true, though, that because the sign of the potential gain from having more social capital is ambiguous or depends on parameter values, there also are situations where you can get into what we think of as a low social capital trap or a corruption trap. And this happens particularly if the gains from trade are small. There are situations, there are parameter values in which the benefit of investing in social capital can be negative, and therefore you can perhaps be caught in this equilibrium that Edward Banfield observed in his small town in Italy, where there was little incentive for people to invest in social capital, which, using the language in this area, contributed to the continued low levels of bridging social capital, the type of social capital that is associated with this trust across strangers. Another set of questions that this framework hopefully provides some insight to is, why does cheating occur? Let me go back to our general timeline, and there are several pathways by which cheating can occur. Now, I should say that there are models of cooperative behavior, and in models, two types of things, at least from my observation, tend to be very common. One is in the model, you get a solution to the potential of cheating, but the equilibrium does not allow for the possibility of cheating. Or to get the possibility of cheating behavior to happen, you have to basically assume one or more parties act randomly through randomized or mixed strategies, and neither solution seems that satisfying to me. So Here's an alternate way of thinking about how cheating nonetheless sometimes arises, even in equilibrium. One is simply that you get bad draws every now and then. Again, this comes from this probability in which the gain from acting in a negligent or fraudulent or opportunistic way turns out to be larger than expected, and cheating occurs. Or another way is that cognitive errors on the buyer's part are possible, and the buyers get into transactions that ex post they should not, or even ex ante they should not have. More fundamentally, what happens is that cheating occurs when the buyers and sellers' expectations of the gains from cheating diverge. And I think that's pretty much a fundamental truism, that cheating is going to occur when people's expectations differ. Basically, the buyer thinks that the seller has net benefits from not cheating, and those expectations turn out not to be true, or not to be congruent with the seller's expectations. And I want to highlight that because that does highlight this constant interplay of expectations in the coordination of economic activities. I mentioned that there are these other channels that our literature has, I think, done a really nice job of exploring. That is, possibility of legal consequences and the importance of legal institutions, and also the possibility of lost business or higher contracting cost in repeat game type settings. So let's go back to this case where I'm buying a cup of coffee, and Cesario provides a cup of coffee that does not meet what I thought were the contractual expectations. And now consider that, well, maybe not only does he risk this potential social disapprobation or the potential cognitive dissonance from not performing well, but also the health department may come in and close him down, or I might just stop buying coffee from him. In our framework, we call those potential losses both through the legal and market channels, as well as the social capital channel. And this highlights an idea that Quentin and I previously have tried to coin. This is a little hokey, but previously we've thought of these three possible channels by which misconduct is disciplined and therefore trust is formed, as forming a kind of trust triangle. That's some combination of legal consequences, market consequences, and social consequences are what bond contractual relationships. Well, if you think about all three of these things and add the legal and market consequences or channels to the social capital channel, you now get what I think is one of the most exciting new areas of research in this area, and that is, how do they work? Do they work as substitutes or complements? And as an illustration here, I just took a total derivative. How does social capital and its use change as the quality of legal institutions increase? And the answer is it depends. It depends on these interaction terms. Although I should say there is some evidence in our literature suggesting that social and legal mechanisms act as complements. For example, the Knack and Kiefer paper, which along with the Laporta, Lopez de Solanas, Schleifer and Vishny papers in 1997, I think of as probably the beginning of the use of the term social capital in our literature. Both provide evidence that are consistent that it looks like legal institution quality and social capital may work in concert or as complements. I'd like to take a few minutes here at the end to step back from the particular framework and the attempt to try to make sense of these, again, sort of high-minded sounding, but sort of difficult to get our hands around soft concepts of social capital and trust. At the beginning of this presentation, I referred to how our areas of financial economics and adjacent areas are among the leading users of the term social capital. And there might have been some implied criticism when I said, no one seems to agree on just exactly what this term means. And I don't want to leave with that impression at all, but rather to applaud this literature for getting into a really essential aspect of the work that we do. And to try to make that observation, I'd like to, step back and take the 30,000-foot view for a moment. When we think about economics, we talk about economics to our freshmen as being about allocating scarce resources. I think it's also a truism. Here I've got a quote from Peter Boettke, that our economic lives and the activities in which that are the focus of our research are embedded within broader political, legal, and social environments. I think it's also common to opine something along the lines of this bottom quote I have from Deidre McCloskey, who notes that the great enrichment is McCloskey's term for the some 30-fold increase in GDP per capita over the last 250-ish years, who notes that this great enrichment is at its core a story of social cooperation facilitated by cultural values. Now, if we were to go back 250 years to the start of the Great Enrichment, there are a lot of competing thoughts about how things might play out from that point forward. And it wasn't at all clear that voluntary cooperation and the Great Enrichment was the obvious path forward. And as one sort of curmudgeon who articulated an opposite view, we have Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes is a person who coined this concept that human life and existence ultimately is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So Hobbes thought about how human fundamental self-interest would lead to societies in which pillage and plunder were the norm, not voluntary cooperative exchange and production activity. And in fact, his solution to this problem was that people would have to surrender some of their freedom to authoritarian regimes, which would sort of dampen this natural tendency toward pillage and plunder, or a war of all against all. And writing sometime after that, but still at the start of this great enrichment period, we have people like Adam Smith, who appreciated this risk. I won't read through this whole quote, but do want to point out that even though Smith appreciated the potential downside risk of a Hobbesian dystopia type of thing happening, he argued that voluntary association and cooperation would win the day. In fact, was winning the day, as he wrote, writing, for example, in the very first sentence of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his first great book, how selfish soever man or people may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, even though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Or in The Wealth of Nations, noting that people stand at all times in need of the cooperation and assistance of great multitudes, noting that even though we are personal friends with a relatively few number of people. So this is my coffee example with Cesario, that I trust the whole, not only Cesario, but the whole supply chain of hundreds or thousands of people that brought that cup of coffee to me, even though I don't know them well. Why did this happen? Why is it that we got Smith's outcome in general, despite certainly notable and important instances of exceptions to this, and despite a lot of Hollywood characterizations of dystopian futures? Why did Hobbes lose and Smith win? Well, again, you could appeal to a number of people who've observed that it was cooperative behavior that enabled the great enrichment. Here I have a quote from Hayek making that point, and raising the question again of how did that happen? A number of prominent people in our field have thought and opined about this. Here's Robert Solow saying that if you ask me what was most fundamental, social capital would be near the top. And in fact, this is a sentiment that is expressed by many economists. Here I've just picked quotes from and limited the quotes to Nobel laureates, expressing a general appreciation of how it is that the social norms, institutions, values the shared culture as well as our personal efforts to live to our own ethical standards play an important role in the type of economic transaction that we examine. So I'd like to submit that rather than this being an add-on and a new thing in our field that we're trying to wrestle with, a fuzzy add-on to sort of the harder stuff that we've been able to nail down or think about previously, that to the contrary, that the notion of the social context in which economic exchange and production activity happens is at the core of the kinds of things that we think about, and in fact helps, I think, bring us back to the kinds of motives that helped at least me, and I think many of us, motivate us into asking the kinds of questions that we do when we look at financial economic activity. Thank you. Let me end there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I found it very fascinating, to be quite frank. And I think it is highly topical, what you just gone through and then explained it. I could have listened it, hours, because I was learning so much from it. And I can see so much relevance of it, especially what's going around us at the moment worldwide, the disruptions and all the I guess unrest, social unrest and rest of it. So I have got a question. I've got several questions actually. I'll start with the one. So basically your model is very compelling, of course, and then it defines the social capital as a resource that promotes trust and cooperative behavior. But towards the end, I noticed that you acknowledge the potential for negative social capital or its role in sustaining corruption traps. So it would be nice to be able to expand on this a little bit, especially the darker dynamics that can eventuate, especially where there is a tight in-group trust fosters out-group mistrust or facilitates the harmful behavior. So just to give you an example, or maybe two examples, let's just say the Italian mafia, right? They're a very neat group. And of course, they are very loyal and they have got this mutual protection to each other, and the informal, and enforcement of norms to basically all these enables them to do more corruption and violence and rest of it. And similarly, like for example, the corporate scandal we have seen in Enron, where basically, all the executives, supposedly, they have suppressed all the whistleblowing, and it enabled them to engage in so much unethical conducts. So I guess in this case, the social capital didn't really erode, but rather it entrenched the corrupt behaviors. So I guess if you would like to shed some lights on it, how would it fit within the framework you just explained?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thanks, Shumi. So as you point out, and in the literature also, there is a concept of negative social capital. And in our framework, social capital only enters as a positive in terms of bonding and therefore facilitating cooperative exchange and production behavior. So how do these negative things show up in our framework? Well, there are a couple different channels. One is the external effects of cheating on in terms of the degradation of the social capital that's available to other members of the community. So that spillover effect is one way that the things that some people associate with negative social capital arises. A second channel is simply low social capital environments. So I had a couple of examples in which the incentive to invest in social capital in some situations might be negatives, and the outcome is that we have a low social capital outcome, and low bonding, and therefore little beneficial activity going on, economic activity going on. And the third channel by which what some people think of as negative social capital entering our model would be if the outcomes themselves were not beneficial. So in our framework, we sort of seed this part of the outcome a little bit by presuming that there's a beneficial or positive surplus to both parties from the transaction if the transaction is faithfully executed. And it could be that those surpluses have themselves have negative components or negative external components. And I think your mafia example would be an example of that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now I'll address some of the question that's been posted. One of the question it's asking, is the social capital homogeneous and measured as a continuous variable? And then the second part of the question is, does it have different spatial temporal properties in different contexts?
Oh, that's a good question. So in our framework, yes, we conceive of it as a continuous variable, and it's a variable or it's a stock that a person brings with them to a transaction. We do think we haven't used the language or concepts of, I think you said, are there spatial, I'm thinking of the sort of like ranges of social capital in which it acts differently. And that, if that was the question, that sort of gets us back to this question of how might you think of negative social capital. But another direction that question triggers for me is I'd like to emphasize that the way we've been thinking about this is that social capital and trust is transaction specific, that I bring with me my stock of social capital, both the common and my personal components, to a particular transaction. Or in my example with Cesario, he brings with him to this coffee transaction this stock of social capital. And that stock of social capital may be different and have different bonding outcomes if he brings to me a different type of transaction, such as a request for a loan.
Great, thank you. Another question is, regarding to the investment of the social capital, is it possible that there is a scenario in which the parties are paralyzed to invest because when they belong to different communities, their one direction investment induce opposite social capital accumulation and then offset the investment gain in the common component of the social capital? It's a bit mouthful. Not sure you got the gist of it, but
so this might miss the boat, because that sounds like a pretty detailed scenario, but please follow up if this doesn't hit the mark. The one question that we've considered, and actually a question I somewhat anticipated or would anticipate in talking with others about this. Again, I haven't had much practice yet talking about this framework to people yet. As we're just going live with this set of ideas. But the question is, well, wait a minute. The way I set it up, the focus was on the seller's social capital as bonding the seller's guarantee of performance to the buyer. But what about the social capital that the buyer brings to the transaction? And in fact, a lot of examples of the concept of social capital think about the trustworthiness that I bring to the transaction as a potential buyer. And so the way that works out in our framework is simply that if I come from a community in which there's a high level of social capital and I'm more likely to trust a stranger, so I have this outward focusing or generalized trust, as some people call it, I am more likely to be willing to enter the transaction with my counterparty. So my expectations of that other person's performance are going to be affected by the generalized trust that is characteristic of the community from which I come.
wonderful, thank you. I'll ask one more short question. Is goodwill a type of social capital?
So I think the answer is yes. Not the accounting measure of goodwill, which is simply a book entry for the difference between, you know, market and book values. But yeah, I think the everyday notion of goodwill is, yes, an example of social capital.
Great. Do we have one more question time, Michelle? Okay, great. So the other one is, how should we think about the social capital of groups instead of individuals? How should individuals be allowed to impact the group's social capital? And how should the vetting process be implemented? Again, sorry, there are 3 questions. Just you can pick just one, and I'm happy to
Okay.
repeat it again. There are too many questions.
So I think this comes back to our notion of there being a common component to social capital, and the common component is affected by the behavior of everybody in that identifiable social group. Now, how you measure an identifiable social group is, you know, is an empirical challenge, but at least conceptually, it's exactly, sorry, the behavior of everybody in the group that affects the social capital that every member of that group has available to them as they enter their own transactions. So, you know, if I come from a community that that's a high trust community, my counterparties are more likely to see that I have potentially a lot more to lose if I break my promises.
Great. One more question, maybe. How does increasing affective polarization, which amplifies distrust and dislike among people with different political affiliations, erode social capital? And what is its place on the mechanism of yours? Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. So how do we think about that? So I do think that a channel that is intuitively, I think, very reasonable and makes sense, which I think our model it would be an addition to our model, not intrinsic to our model, is how people talk and act at large, even if it's outside the context of a specific economic relationship. So, you know, our political leaders, our leaders of other institutions such as the media or, you know, or academia, you know, how people talk and act have an effect on the size of the potential social and psychological losses for behaving badly. And in that sense, people, I think words matter, and words can help degrade the stock of social capital that we bring to our personal transactions.
Wonderful. Maybe I'll just try one last one. It is a very financy type question and basically falls within corporate finance as well as what you discussed today. So basically it's asking, could social capital and trust theory and this framework be used to explain dividend policy at the firm level?
Dividend policy. So that was specific. I think so. And in fact, what comes to mind is there's an LLSV paper about dividend policy and how it's affected by sort of the quality of legal institutions. And I think it would be possible to think of social capital in place of the quality of legal institutions in that kind of framework, in which dividends are a way of paying out cash in situations where there's little trust in management behavior. So that's just literally off the top of my head, but it seems like one possible pathway that you would connect social capital to dividends.
Thank you so much once again for a very insightful and fascinating presentation. And even though it's a theory paper, I usually get scared of theory paper, but this is probably the only paper I actually understood what's happening. So thank you once again, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to go live publicly first time with this paper. So I'll now hand over to Michelle.
Shumi, I am And I agree with you 100%. I typically do not follow theory papers very well. And I actually wrote to somebody in the middle of the seminar and I said, I really like this paper.
Oh,
So I'm with you. Very short and sweet. Thank you, John, for delivering this very interesting presentation that is making, I think, all of us think a little bit deeper today. I will send John all of the questions, whether or not we had time to answer them, so that he may follow up if he wishes. And I invite everybody to join us on May 8th for our next seminar with Marco Pagano. Cesario, anything else from you?
Just to once again to say thank you very much for this seminar, and to Shumi to moderating today our seminar. And I'm looking forward to us to meet personally, and the cup of coffee is on me. Okay,
thank you so much for that.
it's on me for sure.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you,
thank you very
everybody.
much.